The stagecoach wheel slammed into a rock so hard, Margaret Hartwell thought her teeth would shatter right out of her head. Dust, thick as wool, choked the air inside the rattling coach. It was 1867, Texas, and the heat was a physical weight pressing down on her. Her fingers, white-knuckled, dug into the cracked leather seat. This was it, her last chance. "Creek Ranch, coming up!" The driver's voice cracked through the air. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. She'd spent 3 years saving every last cent for this. The war had stolen her brother at Gettysburg, and the bank had stolen their farm in Georgia right after. This job wasn't just a job, it was a lifeline. The coach lurched to a dead stop. Through the grimy window, she saw a simple ranch house, its white paint peeling under the brutal sun. A few chickens scratched in the yard. The smell of hay and dry earth filled her lungs. "This is your stop, miss," the driver called down, his face a road map of worry. "You sure this is the right place? Don't look like they're expecting company." Margaret smoothed her faded blue dress, trying to hide the tremor in her hands. "I'm expected." He tipped his hat. "Stage comes back through tomorrow if you need it." The words hung in the air, a premonition she couldn't shake. As the coach rolled away, leaving her in a cloud of dust, a profound loneliness washed over her. The house looked smaller than she'd imagined, more silent. She saw the shadow of a man inside, hunched over a desk. Taking a deep breath, she walked toward the front door, her worn boots crunching on the gravel. Each step felt like wading through mud. This had to work. It just had to. Before her knuckles could even touch the wood, the door swung open. He was tall, with kind eyes and streaks of silver in his dark hair. A simple work shirt, sleeves rolled up, showed arms tanned and strong from years of sun. "Can I help you, miss?" His voice was gentle, but his brow was furrowed in confusion. Margaret straightened her spine. "I'm Margaret Hartwell. I've come about the housekeeper position." The man's frown deepened. "I'm sorry, but I think there's been a mix-up. I'm Daniel Crawford, and I didn't place any advertisement for a housekeeper." Panic, cold and sharp, stabbed at her. She fumbled in her satchel and pulled out the crumpled newspaper clipping, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold it. "Room, board, and $20 a month," she recited, her voice thin. "I have the advertisement right here." Daniel took the paper. He studied it, and his frown turned into a look of pity. A look she'd come to hate. "Miss Hartwell," he said, his voice soft, "I'm afraid you've made a terrible mistake. This here is the Double Creek Ranch." He pointed south down the dusty road she'd just traveled. "The Creek Ranch you're looking for, it belongs to the Meadows family. They live about 5 miles that way." The world tilted. Heat flooded her face, a burning wave of shame. Behind Daniel, she saw a woman's delicate shawl draped over a chair. A single teacup sat on the fireplace mantel. Of course, a man like this, with a home this tidy. He was married. She hadn't just come to the wrong ranch. She'd stumbled into someone else's life looking like a desperate fool. I'm so very sorry for bothering you, Mr. Crawford," she stammered, turning to flee. "I'll be on my way." She was halfway to the gate, her mind a whirlwind of failure, when his voice stopped her cold. "Miss Hartwell, wait." The sun was sinking, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and red. The nearest town was 15 miles away. She had exactly $0 to her name. She had nowhere to go. Daniel walked up beside her, his boots quiet on the gravel. "I know this is going to sound strange," he began, his voice hesitant, "but you're welcome to stay the night." He paused and a shadow passed over his kind eyes. "My wife," he swallowed hard, and for a second she thought he might not finish. "My wife passed on 6 months ago, but she never would have turned away a traveler in need." Margaret looked at his face, and for the first time, she saw past the handsome rancher. She saw the deep, raw grief etched into the lines around his eyes. A loneliness that mirrored her own. "I couldn't possibly impose," she whispered, though every bone in her body screamed for her to accept. "It's no trouble. Truth is." He looked back at the silent house. "The place has been too quiet lately." He glanced at the setting sun. "Besides, it's not safe for a woman to be on these roads after dark. Too many drifters moving through." Her stomach growled, a traitorous reminder she hadn't eaten since dawn. The thought of sleeping in a ditch while cattle thieves roamed the countryside sent a shiver of pure terror down her spine. If you're absolutely sure, a smile transformed his face, chasing away some of the sadness. I was just about to make supper. Just beans and cornbread, mind you. As they walked back toward the house, a sweet scent drifted from the wild roses growing along the fence. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, the tight, suffocating knot of worry in Margaret's chest loosened, just a fraction. But as she stepped over the threshold, she had no idea she wasn't just entering a house. She was stepping into a mystery that had already claimed one life and was hungry for another. The inside of Daniel's house was a shock. She'd expected the chaos of a man living alone. Dust, grime, dishes piled high. Instead, the small home was spotless. Everything was in its proper place, a quiet testament to a life of order. Daniel moved around the kitchen with a practiced ease that surprised her. He lit the stove, setting 2 plates on the small wooden table. They were delicate china, painted with tiny blue flowers. "These plates are beautiful," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "They were Elizabeth's," Daniel said, his voice going soft and distant. "My wife's. Her grandmother carried them all the way from Virginia. Elizabeth always said they made even the plainest meal feel special." Margaret watched him, saw the love and the loss warring in his eyes. He wasn't just a widower. He was a man still deeply in love with a ghost. "Tell me about yourself, Miss Hartwell," he said, shaking off the sadness. "What brings a woman like you all the way to Texas, all alone?" She hesitated. She'd learned to be careful, to guard her story. But something in his honest gaze made her want to tell the truth. "I lost our family farm in Georgia after the war," she said, the words still tasting like ash. "My brother, he was killed at Gettysburg. Without him," she shrugged, trying to seem tougher than she felt. "I've been taking whatever work I can find. The advertisement for Creek Ranch seemed like a chance to finally settle." "And you traveled all this way by yourself?" There was no judgment in his voice, only awe. "A woman alone doesn't have many options in this world, Mr. Crawford." He studied her face in the flickering lamplight. "You're braver than most men I know, Miss Hartwell." Warmth spread through her chest. Not pity, not judgment. He saw her as brave. "Please," she said, finding her voice, "call me Margaret. Only if you call me Daniel." As they ate the simple meal, she found herself stealing glances at his hands. They were strong, scarred from work, yet they were so gentle as he poured her coffee. She wondered what it would be like to be cared for with such quiet kindness. "The stage should come through tomorrow morning," Daniel said, breaking the comfortable silence. Disappointment, sharp and unwelcome, pricked at her. "I should be ready." "Margaret," he said suddenly, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't place. What if they don't work out at the Creek Ranch? What if the Meadows family has already found someone?" She looked up, startled. "I suppose I'll find something else. I always do." He leaned forward, his eyes pleading. "I was wondering if you would consider staying here, as my housekeeper." Her heart skipped a beat. "I know it's not what you planned," he rushed on, "but I could offer you the same wages. $20 a month, plus room and board." "Daniel, I couldn't." "Please," he said, his voice raw. "Just think about it. This house, it needs a woman's touch. And I could use the company. It gets mighty lonely out here." Her mind was a storm. She'd come for a job, a simple transaction. She'd never expected this. An offer that felt like more than just employment. It felt like an invitation into a life. She looked around the small, warm kitchen. She could picture herself here, cooking meals, tending a garden, maybe even being happy. The thought was so foreign, it terrified her. "I don't know what to say. Just say you'll think about it. That's all." "I'll think about it," she promised. But as she lay in the small, clean guest room that night, wrapped in quilts that smelled of lavender and home, a question wormed its way into her thoughts. Why was a man like Daniel Crawford so desperate for company? A handsome rancher, a good man. Surely he could have his pick of companions. Unless there was something else going on. Unless his loneliness wasn't just about grief. unless it was about fear. The roosters crowed, announcing the dawn. Margaret's eyes snapped open. For the first time in months, she'd slept soundly, deeply. The smell of coffee and bacon drifted from the kitchen. When she walked in, Daniel was at the stove, his hair still damp. He'd shaved. In the clean morning light, he looked younger. The grief in his eyes lessened, if only for a moment. "Good morning," and he said, a genuine smile on his face. As they ate, she found herself watching the way he moved. Confident, steady. She noticed a thin white scar across his knuckles. "How did you hurt your hand?" she asked. He chuckled. "Building the barn, hammer slipped. Elizabeth fussed over it for weeks. Said a man's hands were his most important tools." His expression softened with the memory. "She was smart as a whip, and twice as stubborn." His eyes crinkled at the corners. "You remind me of her, in some ways. Got that same fire in your eyes." Heat rose in her cheeks. Before she could reply, the sound of wheels crunching on gravel cut through the air. The stagecoach. It was back. "Right on time," Daniel said. But the warmth in his voice was gone. Margaret's stomach twisted into a painful knot. The Creek Ranch job was the plan. The safe, logical plan. But sitting here in this cozy kitchen with this kind, sad man, her heart felt torn in two. "I should get my bag," she said, her voice hollow. "Margaret, wait." He stood, his chair scraping against the floor. "I meant what I said last night. The offer stands." She looked into his eyes and saw it. Hope warring with a desperate fear. As if he was afraid she might vanish. What was he so afraid of? "I know you did," she said, her own voice betraying her. "But I need to see this through. I made a promise to myself." He nodded slowly, his disappointment a palpable thing in the small room. "I understand." A knot of guilt tightened in her chest. She was choosing a job she knew nothing about over a man who had shown her nothing but kindness. "But if things don't work out," she started. A flicker of hope returned to his eyes. "If they don't work out, you'll know where to find me." 15 minutes later, she was sitting beside him on a wagon seat, rolling toward the Creek Ranch. He'd insisted on driving her the 5 miles. To make sure she arrived safely, he'd said. But Margaret suspected it was something more. It was as if he couldn't bear to let her go. "Tell me about the Meadows family," she said, trying to break the heavy silence. "Good people. Hard workers," he said. He paused, a strange look on his face. "They've got 5 children, though. All under 12. Margaret's eyebrows shot up. 5? The advertisement didn't mention children. A muscle twitched in Daniel's jaw. Might have been an oversight. His voice was too casual. He was hiding something. "Little Billy is 8, has a knack for finding trouble. The twins are 6 and never stop moving. Mary is 4 and cries if you look at her wrong. And baby Samuel is just learning to walk." Her confidence began to crumble. "They've been through 3 housekeepers in the last 6 months. 3? She asked, turning to stare at him. "What happened to them?" Daniel's face was a mask of innocence. "First one quit after Billy put a frog in her bed. Second one left when the twins painted the kitchen with mud. Third one, she just ran off in the middle of the night. Never even collected her pay." Margaret's stomach plummeted. "And you're just telling me this now?" A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Didn't want to worry you." They crested a small hill. Below them, the Creek Ranch sprawled across a green valley. The house was twice the size of Daniel's, with a wide front porch. It looked peaceful, picturesque. But as they drew closer, she could hear shouting. A loud crash echoed across the yard, followed by a woman's scream of frustration. "Sounds lively," Daniel observed dryly. Margaret squared her shoulders. She wouldn't be scared off by a few rowdy children. She'd survived a war. As Daniel pulled the wagon to a stop, a small boy with dirt-streaked cheeks and a wicked grin tore around the corner of the house, chasing a squealing pig with a stick. A woman in a flour-dusted apron ran after him, her hair flying. "Billy Meadows, you get back here this instant." The woman stopped, hands on her hips, and finally noticed the wagon. Her face was a mixture of exhaustion and embarrassment. "Oh my goodness," she said, trying to smooth her apron. "You must be Miss Hartwell. I'm Ruth Meadows. Welcome to Creek Ranch." Margaret climbed down, her legs feeling like jelly. She looked back at Daniel. He gave her an encouraging nod, but his eyes were filled with a deep, unsettling worry. It wasn't a warning about the children. It was a warning about something else entirely, something he hadn't told her. As she followed Mrs. Meadows toward the house of chaos, Margaret had the chilling feeling that she was walking into a trap. And the real danger wasn't a boy with a frog. It was something much, much worse. Billy tied the baby to a kitchen chair with ribbons this morning, Mrs. Meadows explained, her voice stretched thin as old thread. Said he was playing cowboy and Samuel was the cattle rustler. The inside of the Creek Ranch house was like a battlefield after the fighting was done. Toys littered the floor like fallen soldiers. Muddy footprints crisscrossed the polished wood. In the kitchen, baby Samuel was indeed tied to a chair, babbling happily. Two identical girls were dueling with wooden spoons, sending clouds of flour into the air. A smaller girl sat in a corner, sobbing over a headless doll. It was pure, unadulterated chaos. We can offer $15 a month, Mrs. Meadows said, prying a spoon from one of the twins. $5 less than Daniel had offered. $5 less for 3 times the work and 10 times the madness. What would my duties include? Margaret asked, watching Billy burst through the back door, his shirt torn. The pig didn't want to go back in his pen, he announced proudly. Had to wrestle him a little. Margaret looked at the whirlwind of children, at Mrs. Meadows' exhausted face, and a strange calm settled over her. She'd spent her life managing chaos. Maybe this was where she was meant to be. She took a deep breath. I'd like to try the position. Relief washed over Mrs. Meadows' face. Really? Oh, thank you. When can you start? Margaret glanced back at the wagon. Daniel was still there, watching, waiting. Her heart gave a painful lurch. I can start tomorrow morning, she said, forcing the words out. She caught Daniel's eye through the window. He touched the brim of his hat in a slow, sad farewell, then turned the wagon around. As he drove away, a sense of regret so powerful it stole her breath washed over her. She had made her choice, and she had the terrible feeling it was the wrong one. The next morning began with a crash. Margaret bolted downstairs to find the twins covered in molasses and baby Samuel eating raw biscuit dough. She didn't panic. She rolled up her sleeves and took command. Billy, open the windows. Lucy and Lily, go wash at the pump. Mary, find your shoes. To her astonishment, they all obeyed. How did you do that? A stunned Mrs. Meadows asked. Children like knowing what's expected of them, Margaret said simply. By the time Mr. Meadows came in from his chores, breakfast was on the table and the kitchen was clean. He was a quiet, sturdy man who seemed perpetually bewildered by his own offspring. But the oldest son, Jake, was different. He was 15, slouching and sullen, with eyes that held a deep-seated anger. Another one? He sneered, barely glancing at Margaret. How long till this one runs away screaming? Jake, his father warned. What? I'm just being honest. Margaret looked at the boy and saw past the rudeness. She saw the hurt of a boy who had watched 3 strangers come and go, each one a fresh disappointment. Later that day, she found him in the barn, mucking out stalls with a furious energy. Need help? She asked. He eyed her dress. You don't look dressed for barn work. I grew up on a farm, she said, picking up a pitchfork. I know which end is which. They worked in silence for a while. Then he spoke, his voice low. Why'd you really come here? I needed work. So did the others. They left. He stopped, leaning on his pitchfork, and looked her straight in the eye. There's something you should know, something my folks won't tell you. A chill snaked down Margaret's spine. What is it? It's about the housekeepers who left, he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. They didn't just quit because of the kids. Then why did they leave? Jake glanced around nervously, as if expecting to be overheard. They left because they were scared. All 3 of them. They said someone was watching the house at night. Margaret's hand tightened on the pitchfork. Watching the house? Who? They never saw who. Just a shape in the dark. A man on a horse sitting on the ridge, just watching. The last one, Martha, she found a dead snake on her windowsill one morning. That's when she ran off. This wasn't in Daniel's story. He'd made it sound like a joke about unruly children. Why would he lie? Why wouldn't your parents tell me this? She asked. Jake shrugged, his eyes dark with a bitterness beyond his years. Because they're desperate. They're afraid if they tell the truth, no one will ever stay. They're losing this ranch, Miss Hartwell. And they know it. Losing it? What do you mean? There's a man, Jake said, his voice barely audible. A man named Morrison. He's been buying up all the small ranches around here. For cheap. The ones who don't want to sell, strange things start happening to them. Fences cut, wells poisoned, cattle disappearing in the night. A cold dread seeped into Margaret's bones. This was the real reason the housekeepers left. They weren't afraid of children. They were afraid of a monster named Morrison. Has he approached your father? Not yet, Jake said. But it's only a matter of time. He thinks one of the last housekeepers might have been a spy for him. The accusation hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. He was testing her, watching her reaction. And you? She asked quietly. Do you think I'm a spy, Jake? He just stared at her, his young face hard and unforgiving. I don't know what you are, Miss Hartwell, but I'm watching you. That night, Margaret lay in her small bed, sleep 1,000 miles away. The house was quiet, but it was a heavy, watchful silence. She kept picturing a man on a horse, a dark silhouette on the ridge. She thought of Daniel, his kindness, his strange urgency for her to stay, his lies of omission. He hadn't been trying to protect her from the Meadows children. He had been trying to protect her from this, from Morrison, from the danger that clung to this valley like a shroud. And that's when a new, terrifying thought took root in her mind. Daniel's wife, Elizabeth. She'd died 6 months ago. A tragic accident, he'd said. But what if it wasn't an accident at all? What if Elizabeth had known something about Morrison? What if she had stood in his way? What if the man Margaret was starting to fall for was caught in the middle of a war, and his own wife had been the first casualty? 3 days passed in a tense, fragile peace. Margaret threw herself into her work, bringing a quiet order to the Meadows' chaotic home. She gained the children's trust, even earning a grudging respect from Jake, who watched her every move with suspicious eyes. But at night she'd stare out her window at the dark ridge, half expecting to see the silhouette of a horseman. The quiet shattered at dawn on the 4th day. The sound of hooves, too many and too fast, woke her. She rushed to the kitchen window just as 3 riders pulled up in the yard. The man in the lead was tall and wore expensive clothes, but there was a brutality in the way he sat his horse. A long, white scar cut down his left cheek, giving his face a permanent sneer. "Jake!" Margaret hissed, her voice tight with alarm. "Go wake your father. Now!" Mr. Meadows appeared moments later, pulling on his shirt, his face pale. He reached for the rifle that hung over the kitchen door. "That's him," he whispered. "That's Morrison." Margaret, Mr. and Mrs. Meadows, and a defiant Jake walked out onto the front porch. "Meadows," Morrison said, his voice smooth as oiled leather. "Just stopping by to see if you'd reconsidered my offer." His cold eyes swept over the house, the barn, the children now peeking from behind their mother's skirts. It was the look of a wolf sizing up sheep. "My ranch isn't for sale," Mr. Meadows said, his hand tight on his rifle. "That's a shame," Morrison said, his gaze landing on Margaret. It felt like ice water on her skin. "A real shame. Accidents happen out here. Hate to see anything happen to such a hard-working family." The threat was unmistakable. "Are you threatening us?" Jake spat, stepping forward. One of Morrison's men laughed. "Boy thinks he's tough." Morrison held up a hand, a mocking smile on his lips. "Just expressing concern. Think about my offer, Meadows. It'd be a pity if something were to catch fire." He and his men wheeled their horses around and rode off, leaving a cloud of dust and terror in their wake. "We have to tell the sheriff," Mrs. Meadows said, her voice trembling. "Sheriff Bradley's a good man, but he's powerless," Mr. Meadows said, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "Morrison has friends in the territorial government. It's our word against his." A cold fury, unlike anything she had ever felt, burned in Margaret's chest. This was how evil worked. Not with armies, but with whispers, with fear, with the slow poisoning of hope. Her mind immediately flew to Daniel. Had Morrison visited him too? Was he facing this threat all alone? The thought of that kind man, trapped in his grief, being terrorized by a monster like Morrison, was unbearable. Later that afternoon, as she hung laundry on the line, Mrs. Meadows came to stand beside her. "You're thinking about him, aren't you?" she asked quietly. Margaret didn't pretend to misunderstand. "He offered me a job too." "And you chose us," Ruth said, her eyes searching Margaret's face. "Why? Was it the right thing to do, Margaret? Or was it the safe thing to do?" Before Margaret could answer, a lone rider appeared on the road, galloping toward them at a breakneck speed. Her heart leaped into her throat. She recognized the horse. It was Daniel's. But the man riding it wasn't Daniel. It was Tom Bradley, the sheriff's youngest deputy. He pulled his horse to a skidding stop, his face pale and streaked with sweat. "Miss Hartwell, thank God I found you," he gasped. "It's Daniel Crawford. He's been hurt. Bad." The world seemed to drop out from under her feet. "What happened?" "His barn caught fire last night," the deputy said, the words tumbling out. "A burning beam fell on his leg. Doc Peterson's with him, but he keeps asking for you. He says he needs to tell you something important." A fire, just like Morrison had threatened. "Margaret, go," Mrs. Meadows said, her voice firm. "We'll be all right. He needs you." In that moment, everything became crystal clear. Duty, safety, plans. None of it mattered. Only Daniel. She was on a horse and riding like the devil was chasing her within minutes. The 5 miles to the Double Creek Ranch felt like 100. When she crested the last hill, a strangled cry escaped her lips. Where Daniel's neat, sturdy barn had once stood, there was only a smoking, blackened skeleton of charred timber. The air was thick with the sickening smell of ash and destruction. Doc Peterson met her at the door, his face grim. "He's stubborn as a mule. The leg's broken clean through, and he's got some nasty burns. But he refuses to take anything for the pain until he talks to you." She rushed into the bedroom. Daniel lay on the bed, his face pale beneath the soot, his legs splinted and bandaged. His hands were wrapped in white cloth. "Margaret," he whispered, his voice raspy from smoke. But his eyes, when they met hers, were blazing with a fierce light. "You came." "Of course I came," she said, her voice thick with tears she refused to shed. He reached for her hand with his uninjured fingers, his grip surprisingly strong. "It was Morrison," he said, his voice low and urgent. "He came by 2 days ago. I told him to get off my land." "Daniel, this is my fault," she choked out. "If I'd stayed—" "Stop," he commanded. "This isn't on you. This is on him. But Margaret, there's something you don't know. Something I should have told you." He struggled to sit up, his face tight with pain. "It's about Elizabeth." Margaret's blood ran cold. "Her death," Daniel's voice broke. "The official report said she was thrown from her horse. A tragic accident." He looked her straight in the eye, his own filled with a terrible, burning certainty. "But it wasn't an accident, Margaret." He took a ragged breath. "Morrison's been trying to get this land for over a year. Elizabeth, she was a fighter. She started asking questions, writing letters to the territorial government in Austin. She was gathering proof against him, proof of his threats, his crimes." He paused, his grip on her hand tightening until his knuckles were white. "The day she died, she told me she'd found it. The smoking gun. A ledger book where Morrison detailed all his illegal land acquisitions and payoffs to officials. She was going to ride to the next town to mail it to a federal marshal." Tears streamed down his face now, silent and agonizing. "She never made it. They found her at the bottom of a ravine. The horse had a clean break in its leg. The ledger was gone." He looked at Margaret, his eyes raw with a year of unspoken grief and rage. "He didn't just burn my barn, Margaret. He murdered my wife." The confession hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. This wasn't just about land. It was about murder. And the man she was falling for was living in the shadow of his wife's killer. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the silence. The sound of more horses, many horses, approaching fast. Daniel's eyes widened in alarm. "He's coming back." Margaret ran to the window. A posse of at least a dozen men, led by the scarred silhouette of Jake Morrison, was riding into the yard. They weren't coming for a conversation. They all held rifles. They were coming to finish the job, and she and a badly injured Daniel were all that stood in their way. "Get the rifle," Daniel grunted, trying to push himself off the bed. "It's over the fireplace." Panic clawed at Margaret's throat, but a cold, hard resolve settled over her. She would not let this man die. She grabbed the heavy rifle, its wooden stock smooth and cool against her hands. Through the front window, she could see Morrison and his men dismounting, spreading out to surround the small house. They moved with the cold efficiency of predators. "They think I'm alone and injured," Daniel said, his voice a low growl of pure hatred. "They think this will be easy." "We're trapped," she whispered, her heart hammering. "No!" Daniel's eyes were blazing. "Not trapped. We're bait." Before she could ask what he meant, a single, clear bugle call echoed from the hills to the east. Morrison and his men froze, their heads snapping toward the sound. A moment later, another bugle answered from the west. Margaret looked out the window again. On the ridge where she had so often imagined a lone watcher, there now stood a line of men on horseback. At their lead was the unmistakable, broad-shouldered figure of Frank Henderson, a neighboring rancher known for his stubborn independence. And from the other direction, the Martinez family, their sons armed and ready, crested the opposite hill, and riding hard up the main road, kicking up a storm of dust, was Sheriff Bradley and 4 deputies. Morrison was the one who was trapped. "How?" Margaret breathed, turning to Daniel. A grim smile touched his lips. "After Morrison visited me, I didn't just sit here waiting for him to burn me out. I sent a message to every small rancher in this valley. I told them what happened to Elizabeth. I told them that if we didn't stand together, he'd pick us off one by one." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a new light. "You, Margaret, you showing up here, a lone woman with more courage than a whole company of soldiers. You reminded me that some things are worth fighting for. You made me fight again." The standoff in the yard was tense and silent. Morrison, seeing his advantage vanish, looked like a cornered wolf. "Bradley!" he yelled, his voice dripping with false confidence. "This is a private matter between me and Crawford. It's got nothing to do with you." "It became my business when you burned down his barn, Morrison," the sheriff yelled back. "And it became a federal matter when you murdered his wife." The accusation shot through the air like a bullet. Morrison's men shifted uneasily, glancing at each other. They were hired thugs, not murderers. "That's a lie," Morrison snarled. "You have no proof." "Oh, I think we do," the sheriff replied calmly. And then the front door of Daniel's house opened, but it wasn't Margaret or Daniel who stepped out. It was Jake Meadows, the sullen, angry teenager, and in his hands he held a worn, leather-bound ledger. "Looking for this, Mr. Morrison?" Jake called out, his voice clear and steady. Morrison's face went white. Margaret stared in disbelief. "Where? How did you get that?" "Daniel sent word to us too," Jake said, appearing beside her, his eyes glowing with pride. "He told my pa what he suspected about Elizabeth. He said he thought she might have hidden the ledger somewhere on his property before she rode out that day. Somewhere safe. He asked if I could come look, quiet-like." He grinned, a flash of the mischievous boy he used to be. "I remembered Billy telling me about a loose floorboard in the barn where he used to hide his treasures. I figured a smart lady like Mrs. Crawford might have had the same idea." He'd found it just before Morrison's men had set the fire. He'd escaped out the back as the flames rose. Outside, Morrison was making a desperate move. He grabbed his gun, aiming not at the sheriff, but at Jake. But he never got the shot off. A single rifle crack echoed from the porch. Morrison cried out, dropping his gun as he clutched his shoulder, a dark stain spreading across his expensive shirt. Margaret spun around. Daniel was leaning in the doorway, the rifle she'd left by the fireplace smoking in his hands. His face was a mask of cold, righteous fury. "That," Daniel said, his voice ringing with authority across the yard, "was for my wife." The fight went out of Morrison's men. They dropped their guns as the ranchers and deputies closed in. It was over. As Sheriff Bradley put Jake Morrison in irons, Margaret walked over to Daniel. He was leaning against the doorframe, pale and shaking, the adrenaline fading. She gently took the rifle from his hands. He looked at her, his eyes full of 1,000 emotions she couldn't begin to name. Gratitude, grief, relief, and something else. Something that made her heart beat faster. "It's really over," he whispered. "The fight is," she said softly. "But the rest is just beginning." She helped him back to his chair, her mind reeling. In the space of a single morning, she had gone from a lost woman at the wrong ranch to the center of a storm of violence, murder, and finally justice. She looked around the small, simple room. It was just a house, but it felt more like home than any place she had ever known. She looked at Daniel, a man who had lost everything, but had found the strength to fight back. A man who had looked at her and seen not a burden, but an inspiration. The path that had brought her here had been twisted and terrifying. It had been paved with mistakes and misunderstandings. But as Daniel reached for her hand, his touch sending a jolt of warmth through her, she knew with absolute certainty she had ended up in exactly the right place. 1 year later, Margaret stood on that same porch, but it was no longer just Daniel's porch. It was theirs. The late summer sun warmed her face as she watched their 6-month-old daughter, Elizabeth, sleeping peacefully in Daniel's arms. The new barn, built by the combined hands of every rancher in the valley, stood proud and strong against the blue sky. After Morrison's arrest, the ledger had been all the proof the federal marshals needed. The conspiracy unraveled, exposing corrupt officials all the way in Austin. The valley was safe, its future secured not by fences or laws, but by the unbreakable bond of a community that had stood together against the darkness. The Meadows children, led by a now confident and responsible Jake, were a regular fixture at the ranch, their laughter filling the spaces that had once been consumed by silence and grief. Daniel came and stood beside her, leaning down to kiss her softly. His leg had healed, leaving him with only a slight limp and a story to tell. "You're quiet," he said, his eyes smiling. "Just thinking," she said, leaning her head on his shoulder, "about how a wrong turn can sometimes lead you exactly where you were always meant to be." He looked down at the baby in his arms, then at the sprawling, peaceful land around them, then back at her. The love in his eyes was so deep and so true it still took her breath away. "I used to think my life ended when I lost Elizabeth," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But you taught me that the heart is a resilient thing. It can break and it can grieve, but it can also heal, and it can learn to love again, even more deeply than before." He shifted the baby in his arms and wrapped his free arm around Margaret, pulling her close. "You didn't just save this valley, Margaret Hartwell," he whispered against her hair. "You saved me." She looked at her husband, at her child, at the home they had built from the ashes of tragedy and loss. She had come to Texas looking for a job, a simple wage of $20 a month. Instead, she had found a family. She had found a purpose. She had found a love that was as wild and vast as the Texas sky. The wrong ranch had turned out to be the greatest blessing of her life. If you enjoyed this story of love, loss, and the fight for what's right, do me a favor. Hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more tales that prove that sometimes the most unexpected paths lead to the most beautiful destinations. And don't forget to ring that notification bell so you never miss a single story. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.